In a quiet park in a simple neighborhood, an elderly woman worked with dedication on a task she had been doing for years. Her fingers, marked by time, carefully placed sandwiches in organized rows. Everything was done with love and a clear purpose, to offer a bit of relief to those facing difficulties. However, this day would be different. The presence of a police officer, whose cold voice cut through the serene air, transformed the scene of generosity into a moment of tension. "You shouldn't be here. Get up and leave." The woman stopped for a moment, staring at him in disbelief. Despite her trembling hands, her voice remained firm as she replied that she was there only to help. The response, however, was met with disdain. The officer looked at the modest table full of food and, in an authoritative tone, declared that she had no permission to be there. "This is public property. You're trespassing." Unfazed, she explained that she had been doing this for a long time and had never had any issues before. But this time, her explanation wouldn't be enough. He took a step forward, his threatening presence looming over her. With a harsh motion, he overturned the table, scattering the food on the ground. The crowd, which had been silent until then, reacted with murmurs and expressions of shock as the woman tried to gather what had fallen. Not a subscriber yet? Join our community by clicking subscribe and activate the bell to receive a notification every time a new video is uploaded. Her attempt to protest was met with even more cruelty. The officer grabbed her wrist tightly, pulling her off the ground. "Are you resisting authority? Maybe this will teach you to obey." Before she could react, he dragged her to a nearby container. The sound of plastic handcuffs echoed as he secured her wrists to the handle of the bin. Now she stood there, humiliated in front of everyone, treated as if she were nothing more than garbage. The park, which had once been a place of kindness and solidarity, had become a stage for blatant injustice. The crowd remained motionless, divided between the fear of intervening and the outrage of witnessing the scene. The silence that followed was deafening. Tears threatened to escape her eyes, but her determination held them back. Her expression, despite the humiliation, was unwavering, as if carrying a strength that no one could destroy. With a low voice, almost a whisper but full of impact, she looked at the officer and spoke words that cut like knives. "Do you think this makes you a strong man? You're nothing but a criminal in a uniform." Her words, full of dignity, made the officer smirk. He adjusted his belt indifferently and replied with obvious disdain, "Say what you want. No one is going to help you. People like you have no one to defend them." However, before he could finish speaking, the sound of an engine echoed from the nearby parking lot. A truck entered at high speed, scattering stones and dust in its wake. The tension in the air increased as the figure of a man stepped out of the vehicle. His presence was imposing, every movement filled with authority. The shine of a badge hanging from his chest caught the crowd's attention. His gaze was intense, as if every detail of the scene before him was being registered with surgical precision. He walked slowly, jaw clenched, fists at his sides. There, no one had any doubts. He was there to demand justice, not to be a passive spectator. The atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very air awaited the outcome. The officer and the man stared at each other for long seconds, while the crowd watched, barely breathing. Delilah, with her wrists still tied to the container, trembled slightly, but her voice remained firm. "You shouldn't have come. It's not worth it. This isn't for me." The man, however, did not take his gaze off the aggressor. His deep voice broke the silence with an unmistakable promise. "Ah, it's worth every second. He won't get away with this." What happened next would deeply shake the foundations of that neighborhood. In that instant, the small park, with its worn-out playground and basketball court full of cracks, became the stage for a symbolic battle between courage and tyranny. The sun, now low in the sky, cast long shadows that seemed to reflect the tension of the scene. That simple space had always been the heart of the community, where families gathered, children played until dusk, and where Delilah Carter dedicated her energy to keeping the flame of unity alive. Delilah was known for her kindness, but few knew of the silent strength that moved her. At 68, her life had been marked by sacrifices. She had been a nurse, helping countless people in difficult moments, and even in retirement, she never stopped worrying about others. Every Sunday, she transformed a simple folding table into a symbol of hope. There, she offered sandwiches, fruit, and water to anyone in need, expecting nothing in return. For Delilah, it was never an act of charity. It was the essence of love, a silent cry against the wave of poverty that seemed to crush life around her. That park, to her, was not just a place. It was a symbol of resistance in a community fighting to survive. Marcus Carter was the embodiment of everything his mother, Delilah, had taught him about integrity and courage. As the county sheriff, he performed his role with a seriousness that went beyond the ordinary. To him, the badge did not represent power, but a promise of protection for the most vulnerable. Having grown up in the challenging streets of that neighborhood, Marcus knew the hardships firsthand and dedicated his life to bringing balance and justice to the community he always called home. Every action of his carried the weight of his mother's values: boundless compassion, unshakable strength, and a deep belief that the truth should prevail. That morning, as he did whenever he could, Marcus stopped by Delilah's modest and welcoming house to have coffee. The atmosphere, filled with memories and family photographs, was a reflection of her generous heart. As the scent of fresh coffee filled the space, Marcus enjoyed that moment of tranquility with his mother. He tried to convince her once again to rest from her Sunday activities at the park. "You've done so much, Mom. Let someone else handle it for a while." But Delilah only chuckled softly, stirring her coffee serenely. "Son, there are things that can't be abandoned. Those kids need to remember that the world still has goodness." Her words echoed in Marcus's mind as he headed to the sheriff's office. He knew his mother was resilient, but that didn't lessen his concern. The world was unforgiving, especially to those who had the courage to face its injustices. Help our channel grow. Leave a like, subscribe, and activate the bell to stay up to date with upcoming content. And we want to know, where are you watching us from? Comment down below. Meanwhile, at the park, Delilah was at peace. Her simple table, placed under the shade of a tree, attracted children and neighbors with a spark of hope. She handed out juice boxes and sandwiches with a smile that seemed to light up the place. The smile she received in return gave meaning to her effort. Even with the aches in her joints and the concerned comments from friends, she kept going. That gesture, no matter how simple, was an act of resistance against the despair that threatened her neighborhood. However, the harmony of the moment did not go unnoticed. On the other side of the park, Officer Daniel Barnes watched from his patrol car, his eyes fixed on Delilah's table. Barnes, known for his rigid actions and a distorted sense of authority, was a police officer who didn't inspire trust. To him, what Delilah was doing wasn't charity or love, but a challenge to the order he believed he was imposing. Having grown up in an environment where neighborhoods like this were treated with contempt, Barnes never saw the humanity behind the people who lived there. Delilah's simple, supportive table seemed like a provocation to him. He didn't see a community effort there, but an affront to the order he thought he represented. Something that afternoon broke Barnes's fragile composure. Perhaps it was the heat, the accumulated frustration, or his deep-rooted prejudice. Whatever the reason, he decided it was time to show who was in charge. Delilah's fate would serve as a bitter reminder for him that acts of kindness always have the power to destabilize tyrants. The heavy footsteps of Barnes shattered the park's silence as he approached, his boots crushing the gravel with a threatening firmness. Delilah looked up and immediately recognized him. The man had a reputation, and it wasn't good. Despite that, she stood her ground, with the calm demeanor that always accompanied her. "Good afternoon, officer," she greeted, her voice serene but laced with caution. Barnes completely ignored the greeting. Instead, he pointed directly at the table where the food she had prepared was laid out. "Do you have permission for this?" The question, full of contempt, took Delilah by surprise. She frowned, confused by the sudden hostility. "Permission? I've been doing this for a long time. No one ever mentioned I needed authorization." But Barnes was unwilling to accept any explanations. "Well, now I'm asking for it," he shot back in a sharp tone. "You're using a public area to distribute food. That's against the rules without proper authorization." His words were like daggers, but Delilah didn't back down. Her hands gripped the edges of the table as she responded without hesitation. "I'm not selling anything. I'm just helping my neighbors." The officer smiled sideways, a grin full of sarcasm. "Helping? It looks like you're causing a problem." His response caught the attention of those around him. Murmurs began to grow as those who had been occupied with their own activities started to sense the tension. And then, as if to seal his display of power, Barnes violently overturned the table. Sandwiches and bottles of water fell to the ground, scattering across the dirt. The amazement spread among the onlookers, who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Delilah stepped forward, her voice rising with indignation. "Why are you doing this? This food is for the children, for those who need it." But Barnes didn't retreat. On the contrary, he grabbed her wrist tightly. "You're trespassing," he stated in a tone full of authority. "And now you're resisting." Without giving her a chance to respond, he pushed her toward a nearby container. The crowd around her murmured, stunned, but no one had the courage to intervene. The fear in the air was palpable. Delilah felt the pressure of the plastic handcuffs tightening around her wrists as Barnes tied her to the handle of the container. Her dignity, however, remained intact. Despite the clear humiliation, she lifted her head, her voice firm, cutting through the moment. "You'll regret this. No matter how much time passes, you'll realize the mistake you're making." On the other side of town, Marcus Carter was in the middle of a report in his office when the phone rang. A neighbor's desperate voice flooded his ears. "Marcus, it's your mother. Something is happening at the park. You need to go right now." He didn't hesitate for a second. He dropped everything, grabbed the keys, and ran to the car. A mix of worry and anger grew inside him with each mile driven. He knew he had to act quickly, but one thing was certain. No one laid a hand on Delilah Carter without paying the price. The tires of Marcus's truck screeched against the asphalt as he arrived at the parking lot. Every beat of his heart felt like a war drum, pounding in his mind. The park, usually filled with the laughter of children and animated conversations, was now dominated by a heavy silence, interrupted only by the nervous murmurs of a small crowd gathered. But Marcus had one focus. His eyes quickly found the figure of his mother, Delilah Carter. There she was, tied to the handle of a container, standing stiffly, but her dignity remained intact. The scene ignited something inside him, a fire of indignation that he hadn't felt in a long time. Beside her, Officer Barnes observed everything with his arms crossed and a smug expression. It was clear he was proud of what he had done. Marcus got out of the truck with determined steps, ignoring the growing murmurs around him. His attention was solely on Barnes. His voice cut the thick air like a blade. "Let her go. Now!" Barnes slowly turned around, clearly surprised to see Marcus there. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face before being replaced by the same air of arrogance. "And who do you think you are to give me orders?" he asked defiantly. Marcus kept moving forward, the contained anger making his presence even more threatening. "Marcus Carter, sheriff of this county, and you just made the mistake of humiliating my mother." The impact of his words made the crowd gasp in unison. The tension in the air became almost palpable, so thick it seemed to weigh on everyone present. Barnes hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking between Marcus and Delilah. "Sheriff or not, she's here without permission, operating illegally," Barnes retorted, though his voice no longer held the same confident tone. "Click subscribe and activate notifications. That way, you'll stay updated on our next videos and won't miss anything." Marcus stopped just inches from him, his tall, imposing figure casting a shadow over the officer. His voice was calm, but each word carried an intensity that couldn't be ignored. "Permission to feed those in need? To help children in a neighborhood that's been forgotten by people like you for years. Don't talk to me about laws, Barnes. The law doesn't give you the right to humiliate an elderly woman in front of her community. It doesn't give you the right to destroy the little good left here." Delilah, still with her wrists tied, intervened, her voice firm but weary. "Marcus, it's not worth it. Men like him don't listen. They don't want justice. They want control." Barnes turned toward her abruptly, his face reddening with rage. "You'd better shut up, ma'am," he shot back, his voice filled with venom. Before he could say more, Marcus stepped forward, leaning slightly, his voice lowered, almost a whisper but filled with threat. "You will respect her, or I'll make sure you never wear that badge again." Barnes stood motionless, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment it seemed like he was going to react, but the weight of Marcus's authority and the stares of the crowd held him in place. With clear reluctance, he bent down and cut the handcuffs that bound Delilah. She rubbed her wrists, which were red and sore, but kept her gaze firm. She refused to show weakness, especially in front of someone like Barnes. The crowd, which had been silent until that moment, began murmuring more loudly. The voices grew, some full of relief, others of indignation. "We've had enough of this," someone shouted. "Stop the abuse," echoed another voice. Marcus raised his hand, signaling for calm. He turned to the crowd, but his eyes were still fixed on Barnes. "This neighborhood belongs to them," he said in a firm but empathetic voice. "Not to men like him, who think they can use their power to destroy what you've built. If any of you need help, come to me. No matter the problem, I'll be here." Marcus's words were met with applause and shouts of support. But as the crowd cheered, Barnes remained motionless, his fists still clenched. "Do you think you're a hero, Carter, that you can just fix all of this?" His voice was filled with contempt, but also insecurity. "I don't think so," Marcus responded coldly. "I know so." Barnes took a step back, his confidence visibly shaken. He threw one last glance at Marcus before turning and walking away, but not without a final threat. "You have no idea what you're getting into. Keep this up, and you'll regret it." Marcus didn't respond. There was no need. His fixed gaze said it all. As he got into his truck, Marcus's mind was already focused on the next steps. He knew Barnes and those who backed him wouldn't sit idle, but he also knew that backing down had never been and would never be an option. He opened the folder and quickly began flipping through the papers. With each page, his expression grew darker. There was a list of archived cases, complaints that never went anywhere, and decisions that now made sense. They all directly benefited Barnes. Marcus clenched his jaw as he absorbed the details. The truth was clear as day. Barnes was just a piece of something much bigger. "This isn't just about him," Anne said, crossing her arms while watching Marcus's reaction. "It's a pattern. Every time he was reported, the case disappeared. The one covering all this up is Captain Hargrove. Look here, the reports always follow the same pattern. Lack of evidence, inconclusive testimonies." She pointed at the notes in the folder. "They've set up a system to protect Barnes and at the same time keep the right people under control." Marcus slammed the folder shut, his frustration evident. He had known Hargrove for years, respected him, or at least thought he did. The discovery left him conflicted, but indignation prevailed. Why would Hargrove protect a man like Barnes? He asked, his voice heavy with rage. What does he gain from that? Anne hesitated before responding, choosing her words carefully. I haven't found anything financial so far, but Barnes is useful. He does the dirty work Hargrove prefers not to put directly in others' hands. Intimidation, control. He keeps the problems quiet. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing the office with fast, determined steps. This isn't just about my mother, Anne. It's not just about Barnes. It's a whole system created to protect people like him while destroying families, communities. People like her. Anne nodded, understanding the gravity of what they were facing. If you confront Hargrove directly, he'll crush you. He's buried so many of these complaints. And if you take it to the public, they'll turn everything against you. You know that. Marcus stopped and looked at the folder on his desk. Anne was right. Acting without a strategy could destroy his career and invalidate the evidence. But he also knew that doing nothing would make him an accomplice. And after what Barnes had done to his mother, the idea of staying silent was intolerable. We need something definitive, Marcus declared, breaking the silence. Something they can't erase or deny. If we're going to bring them down, we need to act with precision. Anne raised an eyebrow, intrigued. And what's the plan? Marcus turned to her, his gaze more determined than ever. We'll start with Barnes. He needs to know we know what he's done. I want him to feel the weight of everything crumbling around him. I want him to make the mistake of talking before we can expose what we know. Anne seemed hesitant, but ended up nodding. Do you really think he'll give in? Marcus took a deep breath, the firmness in his voice making it clear that he wouldn't back down. No, but I want him to know that from now on, the noose is tightening. As Marcus paced the office, his mind spun around everything he had discovered. This wasn't just about Barnes. It was a whole system designed to protect the powerful and crush the vulnerable. Captain Hargrove was at the center of that web, and confronting him directly without proof would be professional suicide. However, Marcus knew that letting it continue would be a betrayal of his own principles and his mother. Anne Fisher, his most trusted ally, understood the gravity of the situation. If you go after Hargrove now, he'll destroy you. You need something that will prevent him from manipulating the truth, she said, as Marcus analyzed the folder with incriminating documents. She was right, but the indignation over what Barnes and Hargrove were scheming made him want to act immediately. Still, he breathed deeply, trying to control the fury that burned in his chest. That's when Anne entered again, her face serious and the phone pressed tightly in her hands. Marcus, Barnes, and Hargrove are in the back office right now. They're discussing something and it looks important. She paused, hesitating before continuing. They're gathering information on you, probably trying to fabricate something to discredit you. Marcus let out a dry, bitter laugh. Of course they are. It's the only way they can stop me. He fell silent for a moment, then continued. If they're desperate enough to risk a meeting like that, it means they know I'm getting too close. Anne, worried, warned him, if you just walk in there now, they'll use it against you. They have the resources to bury you. Marcus paused to think. Anne was right, as always. He needed to be strategic, to act with the same calculated precision that Hargrove used to protect his corrupt empire. After a moment of silence, he spoke. We'll catch them in the act. We need something that will incriminate them once and for all, with no room for maneuver. Anne raised an eyebrow, surprised by Marcus's suggestion. Are you suggesting surveillance against the very police station? He didn't hesitate. Yes. This is no longer about protecting my career. It's about protecting the community. With determination, they both began setting up remote access to the station's security cameras. Anne worked on the codes, while Marcus watched the screen, focused. It didn't take long before the image of Hargrove and Barnes appeared, grainy but clear enough to catch every movement. Their voices echoed through the speakers, full of conspiracy. He's cornering us, Barnes said, visibly nervous. Carter has the documents. If he exposes this, he won't get the chance. interrupted Hargrove, his voice cold and controlled. "We'll take care of him before that happens. Find something, anything. If you can't find it, make it up." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Hargrove's cold, calculated demeanor didn't surprise him, but hearing those words made everything feel even more real. Anne looked at him, her expression concerned. "They're planning to frame you, Marcus. They're going to fabricate charges to take you down." Marcus did not take his eyes off the screen, processing every detail. "This is enough to incriminate them," he said, but with a heavy voice. He knew that this was just the tip of the iceberg. "We need something deeper, something that reveals the whole system, not just Barnes and Hargrove." Anne, hesitant, responded, "Accessing Hargrove's office would be enough, but going in there, it's risky." Marcus gave a half-smile, already decided. "They crossed the line first. Now it's our turn." Anne sighed deeply, but knew that trying to stop him would be futile. "Then we'll do it carefully. I'll monitor the cameras and make sure you have a clear path." Marcus grabbed his jacket, his badge, and prepared himself. It wasn't just for him or his mother. It was for every person that Hargrove and Barnes had crushed in the name of control. And above all, it was to dismantle a system that had oppressed the community he swore to protect. Marcus held his badge and the frame of his gun firmly as he prepared for what was coming. It wasn't just for his mother or for himself. It was for all the people who had suffered in silence, for every life shattered by that corrupt system. The weight of that responsibility held him as he made his way to the station, determined to act. Upon arriving, the stillness of the night enveloped the building. Only Anne's voice through his earpiece guided him through the deserted hallways. "All clear so far. They're still in the back office. Proceed." With silent steps, Marcus moved forward, his determination unwavering. He knew that being discovered could have serious consequences, but the risk was necessary. What was at stake was bigger than him. Standing in front of Hargrove's office door, Marcus listened carefully. There was no sign of movement. He turned the handle and entered, closing the door behind him. The room was cloaked in darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of a computer monitor. "Look for anything connecting Hargrove to Barnes. Emails, records, financial documents," Anne instructed over the earpiece. Marcus searched the drawers, but only found administrative papers until he opened the bottom drawer. There it was, a locked file box with constant wear marks. He knew there was something important inside. "I found something." "It's a locked box," Marcus whispered. Anne immediately alerted him. "Hargrove is moving. He's heading to the office." Marcus grabbed a letter opener and began to force the lock. The snap of the metal gave way, and he hurried. Inside, he found folders with names, dates, and incriminating documents. Quickly scanning them, he recognized public figures, activists, and even colleagues. "This isn't just records," he said in a deep voice. "It's blackmail, a corruption scheme much bigger than I imagined." "Get out of there now!" The urgency in Anne's voice made him act. He quickly tucked the documents into his bag, peeking out the door to ensure the hallway was clear. Hargrove's footsteps were getting closer. Anne, monitoring the cameras, gave the order. "Now!" Marcus quickly moved down the hallway, keeping his steps light and fast. Behind him, he heard Hargrove's voice giving orders, but he didn't hesitate. He reached the side exit and, feeling the cool night air, ran to his truck. "Did you get it?" Anne's voice was tense. Marcus threw the bag onto the passenger seat. "I got everything." As he drove home, he felt the weight of what he had just done. What he had in his hands was enough to take down Barnes, Hargrove, and the whole system they had built, but he knew the real battles were still to come. In the safety of his living room, with the soft light of a lamp illuminating the documents on the table, Marcus began reviewing the material with Anne. Each page revealed a more disturbing detail than the last. Barnes and Hargrove were just parts of a network that included judges, city council members, and even other police officers. "This is bigger than we imagined," Anne said, crossing her arms. You've uncovered a hornet's nest, Marcus. If we expose everything, they won't just come after you. They'll come after everyone you love. Marcus kept his gaze steady. If we don't do it, who will? They deserve justice, and that never comes without sacrifices. Anne studied him for a moment before nodding. All right, but let's do it strategically. We need to control the narrative before they do. Hours passed as they gathered evidence, connecting the dots between names, dates, and financial transactions. Hargrove used Barnes to intimidate and silence the community, while keeping crime statistics under control to ensure funding and political power. It was a well-structured machine, Anne said, impressed by the depth of the scheme. It was, Marcus corrected. Now, it's over. With the dawn came a plan. Marcus decided to start with Barnes, using the public case involving his mother to draw attention and gradually reveal the connections leading to Hargrove. We'll leak the documents little by little, he explained. Each piece tells part of the story. By the time they realize, it will be too late to cover it up. Anne nodded, understanding the strategy. The noose was tightening, and the truth was about to come to light. Marcus knew there would be no turning back, but that was exactly what he wanted. Marcus leaned back in the chair, the lights of the monitor illuminating his face as the first news reports showed the initial impacts of the leak. The streets were in turmoil, and the city seemed to wake from a long silence. The corruption of Barnes and Hargrove was finally exposed, but Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. He was aware that men like them didn't back down without a fight, and when Anne entered the office, she brought that confirmation. It's spreading fast, she began, her voice serious. But they're already trying to turn the tables. Barnes is negotiating a deal. It seems like he's willing to talk, but only enough to save himself. She paused, watching Marcus's reaction before continuing. And Hargrove isn't alone in this. He has allies, Marcus, and they're starting to move. Marcus didn't seem surprised. In fact, he expected exactly that. Of course he has allies, he replied firmly. A system like that doesn't stand on its own, but now that the truth has started to come out, it won't stop. He stood up, grabbing one of the most compromising files from the stack on the table. They can try to protect themselves, but with every move they make, we'll make it clearer just how big the network is. And the deeper we go, the more they'll fall. Anne approached, analyzing the documents carefully. We have control now, but if Barnes really makes a deal, he might try to shift all the blame onto Hargrove. They'll use that to minimize the magnitude of the problem. We need to expose the whole system, not just the leaders. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on an undefined point. We'll use that to our advantage. If Barnes wants to talk, perfect. Let's make sure everything he says only reinforces what we already know and connects the dots that are still missing. We won't let them hide behind deals or excuses. Anne, now more confident, picked up the phone to coordinate the next steps with the press. If we keep at this pace, they won't have anywhere to hide. But Marcus, she paused, her tone more worried, this is going to get personal. They know who you are, who your mother is. Are you ready? Marcus looked at her, his eyes reflecting the unshakable determination that had guided him from the beginning. It's not about me, Anne. It's about all the people they've betrayed, the lives they've destroyed. I won't stop until every piece of this system is taken down. That was the spirit that guided Marcus. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but the tide was turning. With every new document leaked, the corruption network was crumbling before the city's eyes. But as Marcus prepared for the next move, he knew the enemy was becoming more dangerous than ever. The fight was far from over. Marcus stood still, his eyes fixed on the screen as he listened to every carefully calculated word from Hargrove. The captain's accusations were predictable, but they didn't lessen the rage building inside him. He knew Hargrove was playing his last card, trying to discredit everything that had been exposed so far. However, the nervousness in his voice betrayed his confidence. He no longer had control, and Marcus knew it. Beside him, Anne crossed her arms, her expression laden with frustration. He's playing to the audience, trying to create a narrative before the next documents bring him down completely. If he plants doubts now, it could delay everything. Marcus didn't take his eyes off the screen. He's desperate. That only confirms we're on the right track. But you're right. If we let him control the narrative, we might lose the advantage we've gained. He took a deep breath, his voice firm and determined. It's time to act. Anne turned to him, surprised, and to him. What do you have in mind? Marcus stood up, adjusting his badge on his belt. We'll leak the next batch of documents right now. We won't give him time to manipulate the situation. Every accusation he makes will be confronted with irrefutable evidence. He'll have nowhere to hide. Anne nodded, already picking up the phone to organize the release. I'll contact the journalists. Make sure you're ready. This will explode faster than anything we've seen so far. As Anne began coordinating the leak, Marcus gathered the most damning documents. These files not only implicated Hargrove, but directly connected his corruption to an even bigger network, involving political and financial influences in the city. The evidence was detailed and incriminating, and Marcus knew that once it was published, it would be impossible for Hargrove or his allies to divert attention. As the clock ticked down, Marcus could feel the tension growing in the police station. He had called a meeting with the officers willing to support his cause. The atmosphere was heavy, but there was also a palpable sense of determination among them. I know many of you are scared, Marcus began, his voice firm and clear. I'd be scared too if I were in your shoes, but this is our chance to change everything. You swore to protect this community, and that means facing the monsters, even when they're inside our own system. One of the officers stood up, his face serious. We're with you, Marcus. We're tired of seeing this go on with no consequences. Others nodded in support. The backing was growing, and Marcus knew it was crucial to maintaining the impact of what was about to come. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Hargrove could feel the controls slipping through his fingers. He knew Marcus had more evidence, and that with each passing hour, his position became more fragile. He called his closest allies, desperately trying to come up with a strategy to divert public attention. But when the new documents were released, they hit like an earthquake. The headlines left no room for doubt. Details of illegal transactions, fraudulent contracts, and even explicit blackmail were exposed for all to see. The impact was immediate. Protests began to form, and social media exploded with outrage. Behind the scenes, Anne burst into Marcus's office with a discreet smile on her face. The news is everywhere. There's no way they can erase this now. Marcus nodded, but his expression was one of concentration. They'll still try. We need to be ready for the counterattack. Meanwhile, Hargrove watched as his reputation crumbled. His attempt to control the narrative had failed, and now he was cornered. Every step he took sank him further into the abyss he had created himself. The truth was finally in plain sight, and Marcus knew there was no going back. Justice was coming, slow but relentless. When the final batch of documents was released, the city exploded with indignation. Every line, every exposed figure was more devastating than the last, revealing a corruption network that had infected the very foundation of public trust. The community, once crushed by oppression and silence, now found its voice. Protests began to emerge in front of the police station and city hall, with cries of indignation echoing through the streets, while the names of Hargrove and Barnes topped the headlines, accompanied by one word in common: betrayal. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was unbearably tense. Eyes crossed the hallways, and murmurs gave way to heavy silence. Officers who had once been torn between supporting Marcus or aligning with Hargrove could no longer deny the truth. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, and the scales were tipping irreversibly. Meanwhile, Marcus stood firm. He knew this was the decisive moment. His actions were dismantling a corrupt system, but that also meant that those still resisting would do everything they could to save themselves. When he entered his office, he was greeted by Anne, who looked exhausted but determined. "It's happening, Marcus," Anne said, pointing to the computer screen that displayed live news. "Hargrove has lost control, but you need to prepare yourself because this isn't over yet." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the headlines detailing the millions siphoned off, the veiled threats, and the deals made in the shadows. He knew that for every name exposed, there were many more waiting to enter the line of fire. "Hargrove will try to react," he said, more to himself than to Anne. "They always react when they're cornered." And he was right. It wasn't long before Anne received an alarming update. "Hargrove called a press conference," she said, her voice full of urgency. "He's saying he has proof against you, that he's going to expose your own corruption." Marcus let out a dry laugh. Of course he'd say that. He's desperate. But seeing the worry on Anne's face, he approached. "Listen, this is all he has. Empty words. He's bluffing because he knows he's lost. But we won't back down." That night, as the lights in the police station dimmed and the noise of protests increased outside, Marcus and Anne worked meticulously. The strategy was clear: bury Hargrove with the truth. Not with rhetoric, but with evidence. And the evidence was all there. Documents linking the captain to complicit judges, fraudulent contracts, and even direct threats to witnesses. "We need to be fast," Marcus said. "We can't let him shape the narrative." Anne agreed, moving quickly through the files and coordinating with the journalists. When the first news broke with the new wave of revelations, the reaction was immediate. Social media exploded, and Hargrove, who had tried to present himself as a victim, saw his narrative crumble under the weight of the facts. Every detail published eroded his credibility even further, and the support he still had began to evaporate. Inside the police station, the impact was felt immediately. Officers who had previously maintained loyalty to Hargrove began to distance themselves, realizing that defending him would mean falling with him. Barnes, pressured by the evidence against him, finally gave in. Not only did he turn on Hargrove, but he also revealed the names of others involved, further expanding the scope of the scandal. Outside, the city continued to mobilize. The voices of the community, silenced for so long, were now impossible to ignore. Posters demanding justice filled the streets, and people, once divided, were now united by a greater cause. As Marcus watched all this unfold, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew there was still much to be done, but for the first time, it seemed like the system he had sworn to protect was beginning to work, as it should. Looking at Anne, he said, with a mix of exhaustion and determination, "They may have started this, but we're going to finish it, for all those who never had a voice." And so, with each piece of corruption exposed to the light, Marcus knew that true justice was closer than ever. When the last act of resistance from Hargrove ended, the city seemed to wake up to a new reality. The headlines not only exposed the crimes of the former captain, but also the triumph of courage over oppression. The streets, once filled with indignation, began to reflect a sense of relief. The struggle had been long, but the impact of the truth was finally beginning to transform the community. Inside the police station, Marcus took on the difficult task of rebuilding what had been destroyed. Trust was a delicate foundation, and he knew it would take time to restore it. The officers who had been complicit in the corrupt system were being investigated, while those who had positioned themselves in favor of change were now essential to the new chapter Marcus intended to write. Together with Anne, Marcus spent countless hours reviewing policies, implementing training, and working to turn the department into a true reflection of the community it was meant to protect. Anne, who had been his greatest ally during the storm, remained steadfast, helping to drive every change with precision and ethics. Meanwhile, in the streets, the impact of Marcus's revelations was resounding. The neighborhood, once silenced by oppression, now came together like never before. Families who had feared reporting injustices were beginning to feel safe again. Delilah, who had been the catalyst for all this transformation, continued to be a beacon of hope. Her table in the park was now a symbol of resistance and solidarity, receiving support from people who had once feared showing up. On a sunny morning, Marcus decided to visit the park where it all had started. Upon arriving, he saw Delilah surrounded by laughing children and families sharing stories. It was as if the spirit of the place had been reborn. He approached his mother, who smiled at him. "You've done so much for us, Marcus," she said, handing him a bottle of water. "But there's still work to be done." Marcus nodded, knowing her words were true. "What we've built here is just the beginning, Mom. We can't let this happen again." Delilah placed a hand on her son's shoulder and smiled. Her eyes filled with pride. "With people like you leading, I know it won't." The community, now united, began demanding more than justice for the past. They wanted progress. Renovation projects emerged, from school revitalization to the creation of programs for youth. The neighborhood, once marked by abandonment, now vibrated with possibilities. Marcus knew the work was hard, but each step forward proved that the struggle had been worth it. At the police station, he gathered his team for a speech. "What we did here was more than tear down a corrupt system," he began. "It was about showing that we are capable of protecting and serving with integrity. But that will only be true if we keep fighting for justice every single day." The silence in the room was followed by applause. It was a new beginning, not just for the police station, but for the entire city. Marcus wasn't fooling himself into thinking all the problems were solved. He knew that the work for truth and justice never ended. But as he looked at his team and the reborn community, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Delilah continued to be the soul of this reborn community. The park, which had once been a simple refuge, had transformed into a vibrant gathering place. The food table she had faithfully maintained for so many years was now an organized operation, with volunteers of all ages coming together to support the cause. The playground, which had once shown signs of neglect, was now full of life thanks to the renovations achieved with donations and community efforts. It was a symbol of what could be accomplished when people united for a common purpose. On a clear afternoon, Marcus went to visit his mother at the park. He found her surrounded by children laughing and competing for her attention, while families helped organize the food. The atmosphere was filled with hope, and Delilah, as always, was at the center of it all. When she saw him, she smiled and handed him a bottle of water, as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "You've done so much more than we expected, son," she said, with a gleam of pride in her eyes that Marcus recognized from his childhood. He returned the smile, shaking his head. "It was you who showed me the way, Mom. All I did was follow in your footsteps." Delilah squeezed his shoulder with a loving gesture. "Then I guess I did something right in life." As they watched the children play in the newly renovated playground and families working together around the tables, Marcus felt a rare sense of serenity. He knew the challenges would continue, but in that moment, he could see the tangible impact of their struggle. The community, once fragmented and fearful, was now united, stronger and more resilient than ever. Later, as night fell, Marcus returned to the police station. Fatigue was inevitable, but he felt renewed, ready to face whatever came next. He knew that true change didn't happen overnight. It required consistency, firm decisions, and the courage to keep going, even when the path was difficult. These values he had learned from his mother, and now they were the foundation of everything he did. In the meeting room, Anne and other officers were waiting for him. They were focused, reviewing proposals to implement policies that would ensure greater transparency and accountability within the department. When Marcus entered, all eyes turned to him. For a moment, he felt something he hadn't seen in a long time, a true sense of respect and trust. "We'll rebuild this," Marcus said, his voice filled with conviction. "But this time, we'll do it the right way." The approving nods he received were just the beginning. He knew the work would be hard, but for the first time, he felt they had a solid foundation to build something bigger than themselves. The road to this point had been filled with challenges, but Marcus knew they had proven something essential. With courage and integrity, even the most corrupt systems could be challenged and transformed. If this story inspired you, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe to see more content like this. Don't forget to activate notifications so you don't miss the next episodes. And tell me where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world where our channel reaches.